Okay, can everyone hear me okay? All right. So it is my pleasure to host and facilitate this next panel. And I agree the last panel was a perfect segue into what we're talking about. And it's been a bit more discussion about investors and the role of finance. So it is my pleasure to welcome to the stage Helene Lee. She is the co-founder of GoImpact. Andrew Johnstone, the CEO of Climate Fund Managers. Keith Lee, the Sustainable Finance Engagement Manager for WWF. And Angela Bai, who is the Secretary General of the China Alliance of Social Value Investment. So similar to the previous panel, we'll do a little bit, just kind of a little scene setter, turn over to the panelists, and then turn to you for questions. So get your app ready to provide some questions. Just by way of a brief introduction, one of the reasons I'm so honored actually to have been asked to facilitate this session is that USAID Green Invest Asia is a technical assistance facility specifically with the purpose to increase private investment into agricultural and forestry businesses that through their operations and practices slow, stop, and reverse the loss of forests and other critical landscapes. So trying to address this idea of the gap in financing and how do you move the money into the places that have the most impact for achieving sustainable development goals or climate impacts. Over the past couple of days, and certainly this morning, there's been a lot of talk about partnerships and the importance of partnerships, but there's also a really important role for finance. How do we pay for the SDGs? Because it's estimated that between $3 to $5 trillion a year is needed to achieve the SDGs by 2030. And this is not going to be made up by public finance alone. If we just take the Green Climate Fund as an example, even if all the commitments to capitalize the Green Climate Fund were made, that is only $100 billion a year, so quite a gap. And a friend and colleague of mine who works in the finance industry tells me over and over again, oh, the money is there, the money is there. That's not the issue. But the issue seems to be changing investor strategies to address the incentives and risk associated with changing how they invest money, something we've been hearing a little bit about this morning, the incentives. And as UNDP Administrator Steiner noted yesterday, it is possible to change, but it is unlikely without a total disruption in how business is done. And this means a disruption in the finance and the way we think about finance and the global financial systems. So what innovations can be introduced that encourage change in the existing global finance system and tap into new sources of finance? Are green bonds the answer? We hear about green bonds. But from my perspective, only 3% go to land use, even though forestry and land use change contribute to 24% of greenhouse gas emissions, and that percentage is much higher in Asia. Blended finance is also on the tip of people's tongues as an innovative way to de-risk investors. Is that the solution? And calls for ESG compliance and standards are growing louder as a means to demonstrate sustainable investment is being made. But we should also remember that finance is not just for corporates, but also for SMEs. As was mentioned yesterday, and I think it's an important point, 90% of economic activity is in the SME space. What is being directed to help them out of the missing middle to finance it to enable scale for impact? And even further down to smallholder finance, smallholder farmers. What is happening in the finance world to support innovative ways to not just have positive financial outcomes, but also social and environmental outcomes that are measurable? So we are very fortunate to have this panel of finance experts with us here this morning to answer these questions and more. No pressure. Among them, they have years of experience in investment banking, fund management, private wealth management, and financial services. And it's a real cross-section of expertise to help us dig into these questions and more over the next 30 minutes or so. And with that, what I'd like to do is turn to each of you for a quick kind of introduction about you and your organization, and then your opening remarks, thinking about maybe what's some of the key challenges that you've seen in addressing the gap, and an example of an innovative financing mechanism that you see is kind of leading the way to thinking about finance differently. So Helen, why don't we start with you?
Sure, thank you, happy to. Good morning, everybody. My name is Helene Lee. I spent most of my career in mainstream finance, private banks, investment banks, starting off as a management consultant. And I see right now we're on this cusp of really moving ahead with the momentum to drive blended finance, but there is this false sense of momentum. By false sense of momentum, I mean that the talk is far louder than the action. And if the talk is far louder than the action, we are not going to bridge the 2.3 trillion funding gap easily. And mobilizing the private sector into this, there's no lack of funding, no lack of capital, no lack of intention. What I see missing are the enablers, the channels, the conduits, whereby you make it easy for people to understand the landscape and whereby they can deploy their capital in the way that makes most sense for them, that most aligns with their risk appetite and most aligned with their passion. So I think I would just end on that and leave for the other panelists to say some more, and we'll come back to some more questions.
All right, great, and that's a great way for me to pick up. My name is Andrew Johnstone. I'm representing Climate Investor One, which is indeed one of these channels. It's a blended finance vehicle. I'm speaking specifically from the perspective of blended finance, and this is a vehicle which has been in existence for about a year. It's a joint venture between FMO, the Dutch Development Bank, and Sanlam, Africa's second largest financial institution, pension insurance company. It's designed specifically to deploy tactically capital into the renewable energy space in low and middle to low income countries, using public sector capital and mobilizing and leveraging commercial capital alongside of it. It's a product of about 3 years design work. It's been operational for a year. It currently stands at about $500 million. So it's regarded as a success of one of the early stage blended finance vehicles. But to Helene's point, there need to be 5,000 of what we're doing. So really what my purpose is here today is to tell you a little bit about what Climate Investor One is, how it works, but really to motivate other people to take this initiative forward, because it's all about scale. We need to mobilize capital at scale.
Hello, everybody. My name is Keith Lee. I'm a Sustainable Finance Engagement Manager at WWF. Thank you very much for having me on this panel. Just a few words about WWF's interest in finance, because not everybody associates the panda with this area of work. So we are historically a conservation organization, as people know, but we do acknowledge and very much realize that the finance sector is key to engage with if we are to achieve our goals that are relevant to conservation and sustainable development more broadly. So globally, we're about 65 people working with institutional investors, with banks, with regulators to encourage best practices on ESG integration and channeling finance towards goals like the SDGs and alignment with the Paris Agreement. And in doing so, we draw upon our wider networks, conservation expertise on the ground to translate that scientific knowledge into a language that is understandable for financiers. So coming to the question of the barriers, I think the issue of risk is key, and that's where blended finance instruments would come in to de-risk private capital for private investors using public finance. But in addition to that, I think a very key question, and that has been touched upon a little bit in this conference already, is the notion of metrics and targets. And how do investors identify the right metrics, and how do they look at target setting by companies or whether it's projects on the ground to ensure that the money that they're putting into projects are actually contributing to environmental and social returns? And with the SDGs, I think there's a very strong case to be made for having criteria that are very much linked to the science behind some of these goals, whether that's the environmental science or the social science associated with the goals of the SDGs. And I can elaborate more on that later.
Yeah, sure. I'm very happy to be here. I'm Angela, General Secretary of China Alliance of Social Value Investment. This is a licensed NGO specialized for SDG finance promotion in China. Actually, it's after 22 years of financial services and 3 years, it's a full-time NGO. Lady, actually, I found it super hard and to close the language gap between the financial services and our NGO. It's I think it's in practice we see much less representatives or best practice its ambassadors from financial services than the other business circles. So why that? It's when all of the financial experts talking about IR, its NPV, its BIS ratio, again, it's really hard for them to understand how to connect those zero hunger, its climate change, as well as energy depletion to their daily business, no mention their long-term strategy. So I see this as the top challenge. To resolve that, I think as an NGO, so we collaborate with 42 institutions, home and abroad, most of them coming from the capital market and the financial services. And we develop a ranking list. And the ranking list of listed companies and regarding to their total value contribution. They mean both economic and environmental and social contribution. So it's based on that, we generated this stock index. And then we work together with the mutual fund to develop this passive as well as the active. It's the public equity fund. So I think I'm gonna elaborate it later. But it's experimental case in China. It's very much aligned with what Libby mentioned. It's from Standard & Poor's mentioned over the last panel discussion about how to make the whole infrastructure, it's solid and make this data available to support the decision making. And also how to connect the whole value chain from the SDG parts until the daily business of those financial experts. So I can stop here. It's very talkative. It's back to Christy.
I just want a couple of things coming out around some of the incentives for coming together, incentives for what you're doing, the risks, the metrics. I was wondering if just before we turn to some of the questions that are coming in, so keep them coming, maybe talk just a little bit, I'm specifically curious, in your example, what brings like two ideas together, the NGO with the financier, or in your example, the FMO with the South African? Yep. What's that incentive there that is why are they doing that?
Shall I take that? Okay. I think there is a undeniable desire by all financial institutions to direct capital with purpose. They need to do that not only for their own stakeholders, but they see the abundant need to address meta themes. Climate change is clearly very evident in everybody's minds, and everybody's looking for a way to actually direct capital in that way. The challenge really is, however, that the world of financing is certainly over the last 10 years has drifted to a more risk-averse state of status quo. Subsequent to the financial crisis and the introduction of quite material global legislation that drives commercial capital, things like Basel II, Solvency III, IFRS, all of those very important bits of legislation are making it increasingly difficult for large private sector capital, pension funds, insurance companies and plans to direct capital into high risk applications. That's the one point. The second point is clearly the need for both development, SDG and climate change investing tends to occur in the emerging markets, low to middle income countries. So you've got two risk disconnects here. And so where the donors, where the public sector capital, where the DFIs, the multilateral banks play the role, is actually taking that early stage risk to take the sharp edges off the deployment of that capital such that it provides access to those markets and to those types of assets that the private sector want, but are unable to accept the risk of. So what we do, Christy, is we take a project and we look at it in terms of its specific life cycles, and we say, well, there's a development stage, there's a construction stage, and there's an operation stage. Each of those stages have very discrete and identifiable risk profiles, and there's lots of money for the operation stage assets in the private sector. There's very little appetite for early stage development. So this is where the public sector play a role. And what Climate Investor One does is it brings these pools of capital together and deploys them into those discrete phases. So Climate Investor One, as an example, is a combination of 4 public sector financiers, and that's the European Commission, USAID, the Dutch government, and the Nordic Development Bank. And that money gets directed to the very early stage, very high risk stages of project development. As it gets to the next stage, then the capital from the likes of the Sanlams, pension funds in the UK, pension funds in the Netherlands, pension funds in the Nordic states, gets then deployed into the less risky stages of the project. But it's the same project, and it's sort of an end-to-end, whole-of-life financing solution, which expedites the delivery of the project. And I think, just to conclude, one of the challenges of delivering these projects is, from a financing perspective, they have a lot of interfaces. So for a project to get from its conception all the way through to stable operations, typically it has to go through 2 or 3 different phases of financing with 2 or 3 different financing parties, and each stage is very difficult to move on to the next stage. And it's the time and the cost associated moving to the next stage, which is really the challenge.
And that sets it up perfectly for me to echo on. I think in driving private capital into reaching the SDG 2030 plans, there is a group of stakeholders, a group of private capital owners that have been relatively under-tapped, and that is the ultra-high net worth family businesses. The ultra-high net worth family businesses typically are able to take a little bit more risk than pension funds. They have also sitting on a huge pool of capital, but in the whole risk and return continuum, if you look at it that way, from the philanthropic capital that expects 0 return,
Yep.
to the typical banks that we all worked for at one point in time or another, that expects not so much impact but 100% financial return, and in a fairly short term kind of manner. What is driving this to the middle, apart from de-risking it, are 2 pillars that the GoImpact platform that I'm building right now with my partners are looking into. I think the missing link to drive the family business, the ultra high net worth capital owners, and we are talking about a 4 trillion wealth transfer between the first generation capital owners and the next generation in the next 2 decades. So what's missing are 2 pillars. Education. Investors need to be well informed before they can invest. And right now it's a fairly fragmented universe out there. It's difficult for them to access the information to make those investment decisions.
Yep.
Secondly, is structured advocacy. And by structured advocacy, I don't mean just having forums where we can talk about big issues. Those are very important, and I value those opportunities. But it's actually helping them understand more some of what are the ETFs that are available that we heard, just now the UNCDF talk about. Some of the products that Michael and other people are developing. So these are important to be laid on the table in a structured manner through a structured platform where people can access it, particularly private capital owners. So I think if we can address some of those gaps, work collectively towards that, I think that will really go a long way to make the action a little bit louder than the talk.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I agree with the education is really important, and also it's try to develop more diversified financial instruments also crucial. But there is a fundamental question lying here. It's, they're doing well and doing good. Are they kind of a trade-off? Is it possible for us to make it better off? It's when we talk about those financial institutions, even the majority of the business, unless we can prove it's they're doing well, long-term wise can improve the doing good. It can long-term wise improve the doing well. I think it's really hard to be accepted by the mainstream players, no matter from financial or business world. And so recently, actually, together with the researching teams, we just reviewed the most of the researching papers from academic world. And we found over 70% of ethics proved in doing good, eventually, especially from ESG part or SDG part, effectively support doing well financially. It's just, yeah. And I think this is really fundamental for the financial world to change their mindset And also, as long as they change their mindset, I think it's very easy for them to develop the new financial instruments, as well as to open the market and then extend their services to currently underserved markets.
So if I just jump in here, I think, to your question about NGOs and financial institutions, I think just to expand upon what I said about bringing our conservation expertise to the table, it's really on the mainstream level, if we're thinking about helping institutional investors properly assess and act on environmental and social risk, it's really about helping them understand how these environmental and social issues on the ground are creating material risks for their portfolios. In other words, how are they potentially impacting the bottom line? People say that financiers are driven by fear and greed. And so on the risk management side, you have to appear to the fear part to help them understand why these things like climate risk, how that creates issues like stranded assets, how it creates issues like market access on the ground for the companies that they're investing in. And NGOs, by having that understanding on the ground, we're able to also help them act on those risks by presenting them with the criteria and the kinds of tools that they can use to create what we might call a shortcut to being able to act on these risks. And examples of that are things like the Science-Based Targets Initiative, which WWF is working on together with the World Resources Institute, with CDP. And what it is, it's a way that companies can set targets for decarbonization that are in line with the science around climate change. In other words, are they setting decarbonization targets that are in line with what we need to do in order to achieve a well below 2-degree world? The other thing that NGOs can bring to the table is convening partnerships. By working on the ground, we naturally engage with a range of stakeholders, whether it's the finance sector, whether it's corporates, whether it's governments or local communities. And so I bring this up because even if you have large pots of willing and able capital out there to invest in projects on the ground that contribute to the SDGs, how do we create the necessarily pipeline of deals for investing in? And so one of the things that we're working on, a multi-stakeholder approach, is something that we call landscape approaches, especially in the agricultural sector and on land restoration fronts. So we're able to work within a landscape to make sure that investment in projects is not just looking at the project scale alone, but looking at the broader scale within the landscape or within the jurisdiction, and basically taking into account the various kinds of land uses within that area and the different kinds of needs of the community and stakeholders, whether that's for wildlife conservation or whether it's to support rural livelihoods. And coming together and by using a multi-stakeholder approach, creating a solution that you can then bring to financiers and saying, here's a project which addresses multiple sustainable development goals by virtue of that multi-stakeholder approach, and bringing in blended finance instruments. Here are the cash returns that you can get from sustainable agriculture on the ground, and here are the conservation aspects, and here are the community welfare aspects. And by doing that, we present a much more appealing, scalable solution to financiers.
So you're starting to both touch a little bit. There's a question, I'm going to bring a question in from the audience. Both the idea of doing good, trying to de-risk and think about on-the-ground possibilities for working with investors to help them convince that it's a good thing to be doing. How do we convince more institutional investors, I think in the sense the commercial side, where a lot of the capital flows exist, that the benefit of starting to finance the SDGs? I think a lot of the ideas that many banks have, have ESG, they have their sustainable development targets, but it's a small portion of their loan portfolios. It's still kind of seen as the special business, the set aside, but it's not fully integrated into how they evaluate and consider that is how business should be done going forward. So how do we convince more institutional investors to dedicate more than 1% or 2% of their funding, of their capital, to say, you know what, this is how we need to be investing going forward?
Can I take a first stab at that
go
first?
for it.
Sure.
Okay, really quick one. I think, to Keith's point, the mainstream finance industry is largely shaped by fear and greed and short-termism, okay, to put it bluntly. Now, how do you motivate them? But don't forget, who do the mainstream finance industry people react to the most? Capital owners, right? If their clients tell them that I do need to look at purpose as an underlying part and impact as an underlying part of my portfolio, apart from just a green bond here and there, apart from just a fund of funds that you assemble quickly for me so that you can maximize your fees. Help me build a portfolio, okay? And here is a lump sum of money for you, okay? But I want real impact with it. And I think that momentum is coming loud and strong from many of the private capital owners. I was in fact convening, together with some UNDP colleagues here yesterday, a gathering of some ultra high net worth family principals. So the talk is loud and clear. We need more enablers because we have the ready capital. And once we can actually mobilize this group in a more organized manner, then I think this will be one of the things that will move the needle for some of the banks and the institutions from being just an outlier, to being more integrated into the mainstream of their product offering.
I think that the counterpoint maybe to that, or to augment the point, is it depends on what capital one's seeking to mobilize. So if you recognize that most of the major challenges around the world have a long gestation period, we're going into new areas of investing, we're going to new technologies, we're addressing new challenges in climate change that throw up which haven't been addressed before, and we're doing it in new geographies. All of those are new things which have unknowns associated to them and have a long gestation period. The significance of that is the capital that you need to deploy into it needs to, on the first instance, be long-term capital that's acceptable to a long-term repayment, and it also needs to be bold. Now, that's pension capital. The biggest pool of capital out there globally sits in pension funds, and the custodians of those pension funds are looking after the long-term benefit of the pensioners. So they are guided, in my view, not by fear and greed, they're governed by risk management frameworks and shareholder value. Same two philosophies, but probably taken from a slightly different perspective. So then you say, all right, if we need to deploy that type of capital, how do we do it? How do we make the jurisdiction that we want to invest in, or we want to deploy that money, acceptable to those type of institutions? And it picks up elegantly to your point, is that those forums, those investment committees and those boards, I don't think they're thinking this in the form of do good and do bad, do good and do well. They think it more in the sense of, if we don't do good, we're going to do badly. And I think it's well recognized now in these investment forums that doing badly is what they're trying to avoid. And to avoid doing badly, you've got to get the ESG component right. You've got to integrate your environmental dividend. You've got to integrate your social dividend, and you've got to get your governance right. So in the old days where impact and ESG used to sit as an add-on to investment decisions, look at the return and then add on this other stuff, the other stuff is now central to actually the return. I don't think that philosophically the conversations that are being held by the different sort of sides of this panel are in fact that different. I think the areas of overlap is far greater than we generally appreciate. And I think it's very rare that you'll find a member of an investment committee saying it's all about the return. That person doesn't exist anymore, in my view.
That's good to hear.
So I think both Helene and Andrew have made very good points already. I might just add and maybe reframe a little bit of that in terms of what Andrew was saying about how you have to do good in order not to do badly anymore. And I think that is very much underpinned by a broader recognition among society, among regulators and economy, that a transition is going to be critical if we are to basically survive as humankind and not burn, so to speak. And so just to draw on an experience, last month I was at the PRI in-person conference in San Francisco. And there was the announcement of something that they called an anticipation of the inevitable policy response to climate change. And they actually had a poll of people in the audience, and they asked the investors in the audience, and these are all signatories, mainly signatories to the PRI. In other words, they're committed to sustainable finance. And they asked them what they thought was the most likely outcome in terms of our approach to climate change and whether we're going to be successful. And the options were, we're not going to make it, or technology will save us. Elon's got this. Thirdly, that we're going to have an orderly transition, and we'll be okay. Fourthly, that we're going to have a disorderly transition where policymakers and governments are going to come in with increasingly harsh regulations to mitigate the effects of climate and probably to drive climate change adaptation as well. And with the findings of the IPCC report last week, I think this, I didn't even mention the results of the poll, but most of the audience thought that the disorderly policy response was the most inevitable outcome. And I think the findings of the IPCC earlier in the last few days has actually increased the likelihood that this is going to happen. And so how that relates to mainstream portfolios is that if you are not integrating climate risk and other forms of environmental and social risk into your investment decision-making holistically, your portfolio is fundamentally at risk from these kinds of issues. So in a way, there is not really a choice. And also, I think building on that is critical for the pension funds to also realize that integrating environmental and social considerations is not at odds with their fiduciary duty to their beneficiaries because of the long-term risks and issues at hand.
So just a question from, go ahead. Sorry, go ahead, Angela.
I'd like to share two cases. Actually, I think in this May is when we published the English version of our assessment report against the listed companies in China, and Fidelity approached us. They sent around 40 financial analysts and fund managers globally, and then it's have a very deep discussion with us. They try to understand what's your other methodology, and which kind of data you rely on, and also what's the indicators, how did you do all of the scoring. And I think in this case means those leading institutional investors, they do have such a strategy for the portfolio management. And then they do need the data support, they need the information to support their investment decision. So this is one category. Another one is we working together with the leading mutual fund and back to China's public equity market and to launch the active, or we call it a thematic, it's a SDG related. It's a mutual fund in China. So now we clear all of the terms, it's very close to sign the agreement. And this category is, I think it's very much foreigner. It's in China. And it got very strong awareness of this one, but they don't have the know-how. And we have to join together, to form the partnership, build up the whole infrastructure by this demo case. And however, they are very much foreigners. I think it's coming from a global market and from China. But when we look at it, it's the majority fund managers. Still, they mainly see the value of this SDG or ESG as a risk management tool. They think it's a screening, ESG screening is really helpful, can help them to tell more about how solid their governance is and how much the risk reputation they could occur down the road. So I think it's back to Andrew mentioned, now the whole financial world becomes more and more increasingly risk reverse. I think it's good things. It really provided good opportunities to SDGs to coming into this financial world, because I think it's look at the nature of the SDGs. We look at the long-term value, and also we always select the best behaving business, and that's the excellent investment targets. So I think that's a good. But key things is we have to come back to the common language between the SDG and the financial business. That's the value. This is no matter it's a financial performance or the economic or the social contribution or your mental protection, all about value. So since we think and talk about the value, then we can see and build the value chain. And then we can bring the stakeholders together. We find the breakthrough, how to make this value chain work and make this dream, SDG dreams, coming true.
A couple of questions coming in from the audience around things like the time it takes to kind of pull the finance together and the extent to which the finance requirements and the idea of projects and a lot of the development community talks about projects and development projects and landscape projects. And what type of financing mechanisms do you see? Is it blended finance? Is it another product that helps pull that, reduces the time of the traditional investment cycle, but also understands the complexities of a landscape project that, from my understanding, it's not, we talk about, there has to be a business too, right? There has to be actually a business to invest in.
Yep.
And kind of, how does that work? Like, how could you help reduce the amount of time? Think about a project from a development perspective of a landscape project that has different complexities. What do you need? What are the components to pull the finance together with a landscape project, with a business, to kind of anchor that all into something that starts to address the risks?
I can give you a quick answer on that. Certainly from our side. So we focus on renewable energy, but I'm sure the metrics are similar across the different sectors. Typically, to develop a project will cost anything between 7 and 10% of the capital value of the project. So if you're going to go build a wind farm for $100 million, you can expect to spend $10 million in getting it to commencement of construction. That's the first point. The second is innovation is expensive. So the more we look for new solutions, the higher the mortality rate of the deployment of these new ideas, and the more expensive that becomes as well. Is that the failed project, the investment in the failed project needs to be recovered by the next successful project, and that becomes a bit of a snowball effect. Climate Investor One, it's a $500 million initiative. It cost $3.5 million to actually bring to fruition, and it took about 2.5 years' work. So what's required is really a boldness of pursuit. Somebody's got to step up and say, let's spend $3.5 million to get this thing up and running, and then you've got to get 10 people working for 2 years to actually make it happen. And that requires boldness, really. It's not about the 3 million, it's more about being bold enough to give it a go.
Right.
So that's my answer to that question.
Okay, I have a quick suggestion that between the funders that are available out there, between some of the excellent projects and programs, there should be a way to fast track it, maybe through a deal flow platform that is more action enabled, so you can actually make it easier for the capital owners to source deals that suit their risk appetite and to suit their capital deployment. Now, different people have different risk appetites. Different people have different capital deployment requirements and so on. So that deal flow platform is not really just aggregating everything out there. That is not going to help anyone. It needs, I think, to be mapped against the SDGs, but it also needs to be mapped against certain risk profiling initially, so that people actually go there and it's easier for them to find.
I think that's right, and also I think there needs to be a recognition that you need to make a decision that just gets you to the next step. I think quite often there's insufficient information at that very early stage to actually get the definition of decision on the long term, and that inhibits going forward to the next step.
So we're talking about a lack of awearness, a lack of information, a lack of data and understanding about
all of the infrastructure.
I'll use a good example maybe. We've recently provided funding to a business, very good business here called Cleantech Asia. Now it's a rooftop solar business. It provides solar panels to the industrial and commercial basis. It's an operating business. It needs bold capital to get to the next stage. A normal traditional investor would look at this and say, well, give me greater definition as to how you're going to get to that next stage. I want to see contracts, I want to see customers, I want to see capacity. They're not there yet. So we'll provide them, in this instance, a couple of tens of millions of dollars to get them to the next stage, by which stage they've got the detail to procure a much more sophisticated and more risk-averse investor than us. So we're the bold guy that takes that step. That's the type of decision. And the further you get up the development cycle, the more bold you've got to, the more sort of basic assumptions and leaps of faith you've got to make. And that's where the public sector capital sits.
In terms of, on the other end of the deal, if you're looking about how to make decisions based around the impacts that you anticipate on the ground, I'd just like to bring up my point again about leveraging, about science-based criteria, but also leveraging what we already have developed in terms of the standards and the approaches. And partly that is about knowledge sharing to help stakeholders understand what approaches and what tools and standards are out there. But a lot of these are already under development. We have things like the high carbon stock approach or the high conservation value approach for defining what we mean by forests. And so just to highlight a quick example, we have the Tropical Landscapes Financing Facility, which is a blended finance instrument investing in sustainable agriculture. And they recently issued a sustainable landscapes bond to a rubber company that set aside part of its concession using the high carbon stock and high conservation value approach, working together with WWF Indonesia, while also having rubber plantations on degraded land within that concession. So that's an example of how you can leverage an existing standard or an approach.
I think it's hard but doable to make all of those financial services getting into the SDG easy. And why is it that? I think it's all of when we come into the financial services, products, or it's all of those policies, we come in, if we borrow the terminology structure from the IT world, it's lying in the application layer, all of those applications. But coming down to what's driving the application, that's the tools. I think it's Diana is from software, just now to mention that. I like that tool and product approach very much. So what's the tool? That's a quantitative model. Now, how to measure the impact in quantitative way, and in order eventually can support valuation of the impact. But I think what's even behind this measurement tools, that would be infrastructure. That's what Libby from Singapore mentioned about those data pool, those indicators pool, and how to connect this SDG impact with this conventional, it's economic theories and management theories, social theories, as well as what's the logic behind all of them. So it's doable, but it's really hard to make their lives easy because we have to build up this infrastructure well and then put a strong management tool, and then to enable, it's Helene's words, enable those applications in financial services. Oh. But yeah, a lot of people talk about the framework perspective, but I think it's because we have very limited resources, we prefer a product approach. That means, is there any product who can walk, along the long value chain and then bring this SDG to the management table of those financial institutions? That's what we're thinking about. It's possible. Think about all of the new economy. Think about Uber, the Airbnb. What's behind that? That's the concept of the product. So coming to the SDG and connect it with the financial services, still the same. So if we always think about the framework and how to bring the policymakers and the market players and civil society together, I think it takes forever. And also it's not very much doable at the current stage. So instead, it's what about we think more in the product or initiative approach.
Thank you. So I'm cognizant of time, and I know there's a lot more to come. So I'm not going to try and summarize everything I heard, but I want to give everyone just one last chance. The one thing, there's kind of one takeaway that you'd like to leave the audience with in regards to closing the gap. What is the incentive? What is going to help change, disrupt that financial system so that sustainable and green investments are fully integrated as a support to reaching the SDGs?
Okay.
All right, you go first.
I go first.
I didn't think about this one.
Okay. I go back to where I started from. I think in order to make the talk louder than the action and to bridge the 2.3 trillion funding gap, we need to think beyond the silos.
Yep.
We need to think beyond the silos and to use education and advocacy in a more structured manner to really match-make the funders with the projects.
Projects. Okay. Matchmaking, funders with projects.
Yeah, education and advocacy.
Education.
My rallying cry is blended finance works. Of that, I have no doubt.
Okay.
And we've got to get it. We've got to use blended finance to deploy capital at scale. That's it. It works.
It works.
It works.
Keith.
I think we need myth busting around the apparent lack of a business case for sustainability in investing. And we need multi-stakeholder approaches to ensure that we're tackling solutions in a holistic system level way.
Partnerships.
Yeah, I think it's off value, by value, and for value.
Great. Great. Thank you. So please join me in a round of applause for our panelists. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well done.